in Assagioli's readings when we read his books and essays. And I call it the ontology of the self. And I will try to flesh out these assumptions in the quotes that is coming afterwards. We find the following assumption in his writings: a discernment between the self as pure consciousness force and the content of awareness, and that's all our psycho-spiritual processes. And perhaps it comes as no surprise to you that he's very influenced by Eastern teaching when he's defining the self. Actually, we have direct quotes that he found some of his understanding in Raja Yoga, in the Indian Sankhya philosophy, where they differentiate between the Purusha, being the self, and the Prakriti, being all the processes, all our mental, emotional, imaginary processes, all our intuitive processes too, because he differentiates between the self and the superconscious content too. So there is a place inside of us where we become the pure witness of our experience. Mm-hmm. And we have that discernment between me as an observer and the observed. And the self is the permanent observer, and the content of awareness is the impermanent objects. And that's easily to see. When we start observing our inner content, we can observe that emotions come and go, thoughts come and go, images come and go. We are in a flux, in a process. But if we keep that point of pure awareness and just step back, disidentify from the processes, we start realizing that I am the one watching the mind stream passing by. And I will come back to the permanency of the observer later. Something he also pointed out is that the self is something made out of consciousness. Something made out of power, of force. And in this, he very aligned with Sri Aurobindo, the Indian mystic in Pondicherry, who speaks about consciousness force. These two things are inseparable. Consciousness and force is two sides, or consciousness and will are two sides of the same coin. Mm-hmm. And the conscious I, what is the conscious I? This I that he points to in the first quote, and which is so mysteriously. The conscious I is the revelation and direct experience that I'm not my body, I'm not my emotions, I'm not my mind, but a consciousness force, a dynamic observer. This is a fact of consciousness. We can have that experience that I am consciousness itself. And more about that later. And of course, the disidentification and self-identification exercise in all the various ways we can do that is the way to achieve this type of consciousness. And all the above assumptions have some of their rules. I'm not saying that Assagioli is basing his entire understanding of the self on Sankhya philosophy, but it's clearly inspired by it, as we will see in some of his quotes. Let's see the next. This is a quote from Assagioli in an article called The Study of the Self. And what we find here is that the self is always the observer, never the observed. It's always the subject, never the object. So we are not going to look for the self out there some way as some kind of an object. The self is always who I am. So when we think about this dotted line and the self up here, it's not an object we have to climb up to. No, it's an expanding awareness where we realize that I am the soul or the higher self. But let's read this quote. In continually striving to observe ourselves objectively, we obtain not only the desired knowledge, but also another result that is no less important and beneficial for spiritual development. This is the attainment of discrimination between the self and the not self, the I and the not I, between the spirit and the various psychological elements, between the eternal observer and the field of manifestation, to use the terms of Sankhya philosophy. It is the difference between the eternal and the transitory, between the fixed and the mutable, and it's the difference between being and becoming. We are pure being, we are pure consciousness force. And it is a radical teaching, but something that we can experience. I will now bring out another very important and radical statement by Assagioli, which we actually find in his manual, the Psychosynthesis manual, in the introduction. And if we really think about what he says in this quote, it will really blow our mind. And Assagioli says, in my opinion, the direct experience of the self, of pure self-awareness, independent of any content of the field of consciousness and of any situation in which the individual may find himself, is a true phenomenological experience and inner reality which can be empirically verified and deliberately produced through appropriate techniques. What does this mean? It means, that's my interpretation of it, it means that we can have the experience of the self as being pure consciousness, not being affected of what goes on in our life. Mm-hmm. So there is a place where we actually can witness and be in a loving appreciation of whatever goes on, and we can be stable, we can be still, we can be serene in the midst of chaos. And this is not a normal experience, because very, very often when we start experience or look inside, sit in meditation and start observing what emerges in our consciousness, we become very affected. If we sit down and we have a depressing feeling at that time, very often our experience of ourselves is flavored or impacted by the present emotional state. That's normal. But what he points to is there is a deeper aspect of the I where we actually can be serene and peaceful while chaos is unfolding in our life. That's not an easy experience. It takes a lot of work, but that's how I see it. And let me share the next slide, and I will give you some personal experience from my own life. Another quote from Psychosynthesis, which is very, very important. The self is permanent, unchangeable, and indestructible. So this is the place where trauma cannot affect us. No matter how much trauma we have experienced, there's a place inside of us that is free, untouched, loving, powerful. And what he says here is that a clear and full experience of the self gives at first such a strong sense of self-identity that it is felt as something sure, permanent, unchangeable, and indestructible. It is realized as such an essential reality that all other experiences and so-called realities appear, when compared to it, as changing, impermanent, and of less value and significance. Such a realization is accompanied by a sense of inner independent, self-relying security, which is deeply satisfying and gives rise to a feeling of peace, serenity, and quiet joy. Let me give you a couple of examples of how this can be experienced. In 2021, I woke up one morning. Let me see, I've had a meditation practice daily from 1988. So I've done a lot of mindfulness, yogic mindfulness, and love the silence. But this morning when I woke up, I suddenly had a huge ringing noise in my head. And after a while, I realized this is tinnitus. And it was such a hard, it was like someone playing loud rock music inside my head. That was not a pleasant experience, I can assure you. And it was just ringing and ringing and ringing. And I was in totally distressed and didn't know what to do. You know, I tried to sit down, do my meditation, but you know, having this high sounding voice inside my head, and especially when I was going to sleep, it was unbearable. At some point, I guess it was around 10 days after this event, I was really despairing. In some way, I had the sense that I was about to become mad because I couldn't bear that sound. And then I started doing a chant. It came just naturally. And I was starting praying to Jesus. And my present persona is not very into Jesus. I'm not speaking a lot about Jesus. But my subconscious loved Jesus. Whenever I'm confronted with some kind of really heavy stuff, Jesus solves it. My subconscious is just full of trust that I will get help from that source. I started chanting within my head, Jesus, 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 Jesus. And I just continued, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And after 10 minutes, suddenly I felt something started. I didn't expect something would happen. I only did it to comfort myself and comfort my distressed inner parts. But suddenly I felt some kind of a white light. Very, very, I get touched when I speak about it now. I interpreted it as angels. And some kind of a peace came. And then afterwards, a total silence entered my being. The tinnitus was way, way, way out in the background. And there was just this peaceful, being totally silent. And I knew right there, I didn't interpret it as it was Jesus coming to me. It was more like it was my soul or my higher self that came to me through this prayer to Jesus. But what I realized in that moment when this silence entered my being was that nothing can touch me. I'm not going to die. I'm able to bear this out because I know I'm the witness. I know I'm immortal. I know I can endure this challenge. So that was exactly what Assagioli described in this quote. I felt sure. I felt permanent. There was a permanency. to the self, which nothing can destroy. So that's one example of how the self or the higher self intervenes in a distressful situation. Another example about the self as this permanent state, because after 10 minutes the tinnitus went back and the sound went up, but I knew then that it could not touch me. I had some kind of a strength to withstand it. And just to let you know, my tinnitus is very low today, and I see it as some kind of a disciplinatory tool that helps me. Whenever I get a little angry or I get anxiety, then my tinnitus goes up, and I know, okay, Kenneth, you better meditate a little bit more, and perhaps you have to work with your subpersonalities. And so today I have some kind of collaboration with this type of distress. Another experience I had in relation to this was I had an experience in my car for around 10 years ago. And around 10 years ago, I started wondering why sometimes when I was among people, I was just still, I was just silent. And I was a bit worried about, perhaps I'm starting to be senile. I'm aging and there must be something wrong with me. I'm just empty in my head. And then I took a long drive and I started investigating this silence. And it was so strange. I was totally empty in my head. And then suddenly I realized I am the silence. I am the silence. I am actually the silent self. And it was like my consciousness recognized consciousness itself, this pure consciousness of silence. And this is the self. And that's why also it was such a huge blow to my serenity that I had this tinnitus, because it destroyed my silence. But silence is there anyway. Even though there is noise, there's a background of silence that's always present. And that silence is who I am. There is, of course, another dimension to the self. And the self is also, as we have already talked about, concentrated power at rest, a silent will. And this is Assagioli speaking about the mystery of the self. Another characteristic belonging to the realization of the self is power. It is a sense of concentrated power at rest, yet ready to express itself dynamically, either in the mastery over all elements and forces of the personality or reuse in creative activity. So even in the most silent, transcendent experience, there's always intention. There's always a will to be who you are. This is the most fundamental will, the will to be. And this will to be will be present even in the most radical transcendent experience. And this is your power. This is the power of being who you are, because we are here for a purpose. Let's speak about how we can develop this self. In another quote by Assagioli, he speaks about that in order to strengthen and make stable the pure self-awareness of the observer, it is necessary to have periods of inner silence, gradually longer to make what is called the void in the field of consciousness. So we have to cultivate an atmosphere of quietness. We have to cultivate in us an ability to be in silence and identify with the silence. And by doing that every morning, cultivating this silence, we become ourselves. So the conscious I or the personal self is not something that just emerges out of the blue like a pearl that is fully formed. No, the conscious self is a seed. It is a seed that we have to nurture every day through meditation and self-recollection. And the more we nourish this self, the more it will start to blossom as silence, as a place within us where we are always present to ourselves in each moment. And of course, then life will take us everywhere. We get overwhelmed by emotions, and our loved one triggers us, and all this stuff happens. But if we have first found this place, we always have a place to return to and collect ourselves, a place of strength. So this is a prerequisite. We have to cultivate silence and identify with the silence, which is consciousness itself. How much time have I left? For me, it's okay. That's an eternity. There are 4 stages of the I consciousness, according to my estimation. At some time in our life, there was no conscious observer, and we just take life as it comes. In some way, we can say that we just flow with the stream of consciousness. And we go from one role to another. Then at another time, we create a boat where we can navigate on the stream of consciousness. And that's all our major roles in life. We become parent, we establish a relationship, we have a professional role. And these identification with the psychological functions is our surface identity. And it helps us navigate all the different waves of emotion and impulses. And we can say at this stage, we are like a people that lives in a city where it's always clouded. They never see the sun. They just take the light for granted. But sometimes in that city, some courageous individual climbs up the mountain and see that above the sky there is the sun. And they suddenly realize the source of the light. And this is what happens when we start becoming the observer. We start knowing, wow, I am my own light. The self is light, consciousness is light. But at first, the observer we develop is a foggy observer. The light is very diffused. Anyone knows when, especially if you're tired and you sit down and meditate, not much is going on. You're not seeing your inner psychological world in ultra high D. It's very foggy. But if you again and again and again strengthen the seed of consciousness, it will become stronger and stronger. And then at some time, you will realize that you are actually this silent, loving, dynamic observer that can be present to your inner environment in each and every moment. This is you. This is your essential being. And this is where you see the sun, or actually you don't see the sun, because that's dualism. You become the sun of your own inner world. The last stage, I don't know what it is. I'm not there where every morning I wake up, there's just total silence, and the present of the I is just there in its bare nakedness. But from the experiences I have, I bet that Assagioli is correct. And also Vedanta, also Raja Yoga, also these Eastern teachings that point to this reality that there is inside of you a detached, loving, powerful observer. I have much more to share like this, but luckily I have already recorded a video back home. I will upload it on my YouTube channel so you can look for yourself. But I think it's a good place to stop today because the experience of the conscious I have many of the same qualities as the more transcendent aspect of your nature. So thank you for today and for your listening. It was a great experience.